So we're going to be talking about React Native and how you can build cross-platform with React Native. And first things first, you actually can't talk about React Native without talking about React. React is a JavaScript library for building web applications, and it's a UI framework. And one of the key features that React has is it's declarative. So what does that mean? So if you want to go from, say, a gray to a blue like, you could write code that looks something like this. What you're saying is a user likes, if there is a blue like, I want to put a green like, and all those. It's a lot of instructions that are going on. Whereas if you were going to do this in a declarative fashion, you would probably just set something that says, this is what I want my UI to look like for a given state. So with React, your UI is rendered as a function of the current state. So how does that work? So what React Native does is it has a virtual DOM, like a document object model, which is a representation of all the H1s and the tags, et cetera. And then there's the real DOM, and React just basically calculates the minimum set of changes that it needs to do. So it does all of the instructions for you. So if you wanted to go from the top to the bottom, and what you would typically do is React would just make the minimum changes, like adding the text that you like this, and making the icon blue and the text blue. And that's what React is going to take care of for you. Another feature that React does is everything is composed of components. So components are the basic building blocks. So let's take a look at, for example, something that would represent, say, a feedback component. It could be composed of a like component, a like info, and a comment info. These could be separate things that could be reused in other contexts. And if you look at React code, it would look something similar to this. So you would have a class, which in this case is a feedback component, and there's a render function, which every component should have, and there are 3 components that it's rendering at the moment. And there's 2 key things that happen with the components. You could pass in something called props, and props is what a component is, and it's generally passed from the parent to the child. But a component could also keep track of state, what it's doing inside itself. And the difference between state and props is state is something that can change. So if you look at the onPress command here, or the method here, it's actually changing the state of the liked. But in essence, a props is something that cannot be changed. It's passed from parent to child. Whenever the props or the state changes, the whole component is re-rendered. So those are kind of like a key of what the basic building blocks looks like for React. Another key piece with React is a one-way data flow. So in the example you saw before, you could have a feedback component that's passing in props to a like. And when somebody clicks on a like, there's an event callback that can go back to the parent component, which will change its state, which passes the data back to the child component. And this one-way data flow makes it really easy to reason about when you're actually debugging things or looking to see what changed where. So what React Native is, it brings the React paradigm. So you're writing code in JavaScript, but the code is actually running natively on the device. So when the code is running, there is no DOM. It's not wrapped in a web view. When you write a view in JavaScript, it's actually going to be running on the device as a UI view in the case of iOS. And in Android, for example, a text, when you write it, it's actually going to be writing a text view. No DOM whatsoever. What's happening under the bridge is the instructions that you write are going to go across something called a bridge and then show up on the native app. And then when somebody actually interacts with the app, instructions come across the bridge, and then that's how the loop happens. Everything is running natively. And the thing that I know I like really about React Native is just the way that you do development with it. So in this example, let's say we want to make some of the icons a little bigger. You'd write your code, and on the left is like lots of little code in there. And you have something called hot reload. So as you're making changes, you could see your changes right away. You could go ahead and perhaps make an error or something. You would get instant feedback about what went wrong to something called a red box. So the red box would show up in there. It'll give you direction into what you can change. You can go ahead and make a fix for what you messed up on, and it'll immediately go ahead and change that and make that better. It's a very fast development workflow. It makes it very easy to work with React Native. And just kind of like kicks off when you're interested. There's no kind of like a build compile phase. Another thing that I like about React Native is just the way that you can do layout with it. So for example, there's some property that you can set on an object called flex direction. So is your information flowing across the row, or is it flowing in a column direction? And based on that, if it's flowing in the main axis is your components or the information flex start, in the middle, at the end, and then you can also specify the cross-axis, how you want your components laid out. As an example, you can see here, this is kind of like a row which represents sort of like a movie app. And if you look at the code in here, there's a view and then a styles property with the objects. And here you can see that there's a row property which says that everything is flowing on a row, and you want things aligned on the cross-axis in the center. And then you can add other things for padding and background color. It makes it really easy to do layout with React. And with React Native, another key thing is that along with developer efficiency, when you're writing the code and it's running natively, we've got the main thread which is handling the touch event. We've got another separate thread that's running with the JavaScript code that you write. And finally, there's a layout thread that's calculating and measuring all of the different layouts. And those are the key pieces that bring it together to make a nice user experience. So that's a quick introduction of what React Native is. And we're going to go ahead and jump into a demo. And in this demo, we are going to kind of create a couple of basic React Native components or UI elements that we're going to use later on. So I trust that everyone has at least, give me an idea, how many people have actually set up the prerequisite? Hands? Almost everyone in the room? Excellent. Did anyone be able to do the Android setup? One brave soul. Oh, how many? OK, great. So we're going to go through and show the different things. So even if you haven't set up your Android and development environment yet, you can at least kind of go through it and get a sense of what it looks like. So the first thing is that you need to do is go ahead and open up Terminal or something like that, and then just set up, make sure you have the ability to run some commands. And the first thing that you want to do is go into wherever it is that you set up your code. So it's demo1 starter. In my case, it was demo1 starter mashup. So if you go into that directory, the first thing you want to do is bring in the node modules that are the React dependencies. And the way you're going to do it, if you installed yarn, is yarn install. I've already run it, so I'm not going to run it. It shouldn't take too long to run. But run yarn.install. It's going to create some node modules directory, and we're going to go from there. The next thing I'm going to do is actually kick up and start the actual React app. There's a starter app that was created as part of that. So React Native, run iOS. So if you set up all of your prerequisite, React Native, run iOS, it should be the CLI that you can run to kind of set up your React application. But before I do that, and as you run that, what I'm going to do is show you the finished application. So this is the finished application that you should see if you've actually gone through it and run your lab. It's a photo sharing app, and in the photo sharing app, you can take photos from your library, and then there's a few things that can happen. You can actually vote up on a particular photo, say it made me sad. It'll change in there. You have the ability to actually bring in Instagram feed, just to kind of show you how you can do that. This is actually going to be a React view. And lastly, we've got a settings area where you can actually see your Instagram profile. So that's the finished application. So we're going to work on just some of the building blocks for that. So while that is running, I'm going to start up my React application. And what I'm starting up right here is the standalone React application that you would get if you actually just created a bare bones React application. And it's just going to set up, and it's going to build and check your dependency, put everything together, and run it. While that's going on, because it could take a little bit of time, I'm going to show you the actual code that gets set up automatically. Let's just sidetrack for that. This little pop-up that showed up. What that is called a packager. So it's bundling all the JavaScript code that you have and making it available on a URL. And that URL can then be read from your actual native code. So that's the packager running. All right, so the package is up and running, and it's continuing to build the React Native code. Let's look at some of the key pieces of code in here. If you open your file, and I'm using Sublime, but you could use your favorite text editor. Some folks like to use Atom, anything that works for you. We're just going to be editing JavaScript code. So the file I'm looking at is in demo1 mashup. and then it's called index.ios.js. Hopefully you can get to that. And scrolling past a lot of the boilerplate, you have here your React code that's being set up in here. This is where you're importing all of the libraries that you need. These are some of the standard components that we're going to be using in this particular component. Here's the component. It's called Mashup, and this was created by default when I actually created an app using React Native in it. And this actually has one render function. And in the render function, it's returning a view, some text, a couple of text fields. And then there's also style elements here. And what you see here is the React Native Run iOS has actually brought up my UI here. Let's go ahead and just play around with the development workflow. Change welcome to React Native, and just say RWDevCon 2017. And I'm going to save it. And you can do the same. And if you go back here, I could hit Command R, and it's going to reload it and show the text. There's no need to build and compile. The other thing that you could do is you can hit Command D. And Command D is going to bring up a developer menu, a debug menu. And here I can enable live reload. That means that whenever I make any changes now to my JavaScript file, it's going to be immediately reloaded automatically. So let's make a simple change here. Let me just change the background color to something I know it's going to mess up, not a color. And as I save it, it's immediately going to give me feedback that something went wrong. I can then go back and change it to something that actually works, save it, and I've got my right input. So similarly with Android, another thing they can do while we're waiting, for anyone who actually set up the Android, is run Android. So React Native Run Android is going to kind of kick up and do the same thing that was done for iOS. It's going to use Gradle to do the build automatically, create an APK. And you only want to do that if you also have your emulator up and running. I'm using Gradle. It doesn't think it thinks it's not connected. It's PWD. So let me go ahead and close this. I'm going to restart my Genymotion. So sometimes it does that and it kind of gets disconnected. So while my emulator is starting up, I can go ahead and make sure I run this again. React Native Run Android. And for my Android, I just kind of want to give you a sense. The Android file looks similar to index.android.js, looks similar to the iOS file. It's just slightly different. And the only difference here is that you just have separate instructions. When something is running, the entry point is either index.ios or index.android. And that's a quick way that you can actually set things up. Now, while that's actually starting, what we're going to do is do something different. We're going to create one single entry point for both. So you've seen the Android here. We can do the same thing in Android, but in this case, we can change index.android.ios and say same thing, RDevCon Android. In your emulator, what you would do here if you wanted to do debug is you could open up the debug menu by clicking on menu and click reload, and you'd get the same changes. So what we want to do now is create a single entry point for both iOS and Android so that we don't have to keep making changes in two places. So the way I could do that is I'm just going to create a separate file, which is a component, and I'm going to be able to import this component from both places. I'm going to create the file in the JS directory. So in Sublime, or whatever it is, just create a new file under the JS directory. And in my case, let's just name this file media app.js. And once I save that, it's available here. And for kicks, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take the contents from index.ios.js and copy it over into media app.js. And then I'm going to make a few changes that are needed to make it a standalone component. So I've just copied the file over. This app registry is usually used only in the entry point file, and you don't really need it in here in a standalone component. So we're going to get rid of that. We're going to trim this file so there's very little going on here. Let's get rid of these 2 text fields. Just leave one. So it's always easy to get rid of stuff. We don't need the styles because these are related to the welcome and the instructions. So let's get rid of that too. The other thing we want to do is let's just rename this component to match the name of the file. So let's call it media app. And then lastly, we don't need this app registry. It's only needed for the entry point. So we just created a very simple file that's standalone. But once we've created it, let's use it inside our different entry points. So head over to the index.ios.js file. And in there, make a few changes. This is the index.ios.js file. We still need this register component, but we don't need this. We're going to be using the different component that we just created, so we're going to be able to get rid of a whole bunch of things. So I'm going to cut pretty much everything. In fact, I'm going to cut everything so it's down to just the app registry. And now you're like, where am I going to get my component from? The way you can do this is you're going to import, and let's just call it media app from, and this is the component that you just created, media app. So this is a new component that we kind of brought out, and we can now use it to replace here. This is the root component. And once you've done that, you can then save it. And if you have everything set up the way I have, and you have live reload on, you'll get your changes immediately there. I'm just going to copy and paste the same content from the index.ios, put it in index.android. And what this means is now I'm going to have a common separate file called media app that I can use from both places. And I'm going to save that in here. And if I were to go back here, if you have your Android emulator and check out the menu and reload, you now got the same content. So this is just a way that we're going to set up to have one entry point. Just raise your hand if you're sort of like with me at this point. Okay. So now the next thing we're going to do is let's add up that list view that we were talking about. So there's a list view that's going to represent the Instagram feed. And the way we're going to do that is now we have one entry point, which is media app. We are going to use a component that's going to show us the list view. When you're working with the list view, the 2 things that you need to do is, first of all, bring in a list view component. So you add it to the import statements. Once you have the list view component, we're going to go in here and we are going to replace this text with the list view. So list view. And this component takes 2 props. One is the data source, similar to what you would do with iOS. And it's called data source. And we're going to fill this later. And then the other one is something called render row. And again, render row is going to be called, it expects a command or a method, and it's going to be called with each row that needs to be rendered. So let's figure out what are we going to render. For the purposes of this demo, we've actually pre-filled in some kind of like data, some static data. It's available under the data folder. And I'm going to show you what it is. This data came from an API call to Instagram. I took a snapshot, I saved the data, and I wrapped it so that it could be reused. It's just an Instagram API call. And what we're going to do is we're going to show the image, so this image here, and then we're also going to show some user information. So this is an array of information of all of the different photos, and we're going to use that as our data source. So first things first, let's actually import, let's just call it snapshot. And it's actually data. tag underscore media. Now we'll have access to like a JavaScript object representing the snapshot feed. And then what we're going to do is we are going to store our data source in something called a state. And when we're working with state, usually you initialize it in a constructor. So the way you do it in a component is just set up a constructor and call super. And then we're going to set up a data source. So let's just call const ds equals to a new ListView data source. And when you set up a new data source, you need to give it a function which is called, or a property called row has changed. And when you do this, you give it a function. So this is just a way that you could write a function using arrow. So you say a row is different from another one if the first row is not equivalent to the second row. So we've set up a data source. Now let's just store this data source in a state. So say this.state, we're initializing a state, and we're just going to call this particular part of a state and pass in a data source. Now we've initialized the state, how about we fill it in when, with the actual dummy data? And the way you can do that is you can process the data that came from snapshot feed. The best way to do this is to probably do it in the equivalent of an iOS world is a view.load. But in component has lifecycle methods called component.mount. So in component.mount, we're actually going to process the data. But let's actually create a standalone function that will process the data. So I'm going to process data. I've named it with an underscore just so I can actually say, you know, this is a method that's private to the component. And in this process data, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through this tag media and just loop through and get the key pieces of data and then stuff it into the data source. So for that, just create an array that's going to hold, and then do a quick check to see if we actually have real data. And then we're just going to loop through the data and kind of create our little data that we're then going to stuff into the data source. So we'll show the code, write the code, and then see what's going on. So I'm going to use this handy-dandy way to just kind of map through, data.map. And I'm going to take in each entry and then define a function. So in this function, what I'm going to do is based on the entry, let me just get the author. And I'm picking this apart from the JSON that gets returned. And the author is going to come from the entry.user.username. We've got the profile picture, which we're going to say profile pic is equal to entry.user.profile_pic. And then the actual photo that was taken, that comes from a little bit different place, entry.images.standard.resolution.url. And then once we have this, let's just update our array, just calling media.push, and then creating a new key value pair, and the key will be author, and the value will be author, profile, pic, and photo. So we've got this media, updated the array, and as we've looped through this, the last thing we want to do is update the data source. Let me just make it slightly bigger. So we can do that by calling setState. And when we call setState, we just want to make sure that the current state, which is the data source, and the way you can update a data source is by calling something called clone with rows on the data source itself. So clone with up, like this one? This one? Okay. Okay, so clone with rows and give it the updated content. So we've now updated the state. Let's just make sure we can see the whole thing. Do the semicolon thing, JavaScript and semicolons. So we've now got this, this method that we've created Let's actually hook it into the component lifecycle by in component did mount. We're going to call this and what we just set up and pass in the snapshot feed. So we've now got our data. We've got it set up. We can now actually go into the list view and say this dot data, this dot state. Now we've got our data source set up. Now the next thing we want to do is to say what gets rendered when we actually run this. And what gets rendered is we're going to create a function called render row that gets called by render row. And let's just call it render row. And it gets passed in the actual row data. And the row data is going to be the piece of the data source. So in this case, it's actually going to be like the author, the profile picture. So let's very quickly see something. So you can return a component. And then the component we're going to return is the row data author, just to see that it's working. Oh, sorry, that is my bad. I need to actually return. All right. So those are the changes in there. And now we can actually call this render row here. Okay. Just checking if everyone's sort of with me right now, or if there's any pieces that we need to look at. But now if we save this, of course I have a spelling mistake quickly. Standard resolution. So here we've, I just made a spelling mistake. Now we've just got the author's name here. Purple is kind of starting to wear thin on me, so let me change this to white. And also add in a margin so there's a little bit of separation. So we've got the author name. Now the thing I'm going to do really quickly is just bring in the profile picture and the actual photo. And for that, all we need to change is actually the render row function and get the other pieces of data. For the picture and the profile photo, you need to actually bring in another component, which is an image. So once we've got the image in here, we can then reuse it. When you're showing an image, the two things that you need to give is probably the style, the width, and the height. And the other thing you need to do is just give it a source. The source, if it's a remote thing, could be the URI, so then it's going to go and grab it and bring it down. And if it's a local thing, you just need to require to where the local file is. So let's actually change this render row. And with React, you generally to return back one component. So I'm actually going to create a view. But in the view, let me just bring in this text, copy it, cut and paste it. But now I'm actually going to have a profile picture and I'm going to have a photo. So for the profile picture, it's an image, and we're going to create a style, pass in a style which is going to give us an object with two parameters. Now here I'm actually typing the style inline instead of having it as a separate, and you can do that very quickly if you're just prototyping. So I give it a width and a height of 40, and then I give it a source. And for the source, you would need to give it, if it's something that's remote, is a URI, and row data dot, I think it's called profile pic. For the photo, we can do the same thing, and but instead of 40, let's just make this 420, and then make this photo. So if I were to save this, I should now actually get, and run this, I should now get the profile picture. Profile picture's coming in blank. So row data to profile pic. Sometimes I do spelling mistakes, but user profile picture, of course I did. So now you've got your profile picture showing up there. And a really neat trick that you can do is if you wanted to have like rounded corners, then you could just actually add in an attribute. Let's make that 40. Border, radius, like half. And then you get this rounded look. So there's another thing that we can do. We're not going to do it right now in the interest of time, but you probably want this header, the profile picture, and the username to be on a row by itself. That way we could do that, and what it looks like in the final app is these two pieces are wrapped in its own view, where you set the flow, the flex direction to be a row, and your line items to be the center. And you can see how that's done. For now, we're going to do something really quickly where we are, if you have time, just to kind of quickly set up the other thing, which is the view. And then we can, actually we can probably just skip that, but what that will do is that we could actually set up the second view for the feedback. And I'll just quickly show you what we would be going through. So we've got this actually another entry point called feedback app, similar to media app. And what in the feedback app you would do is in the feedback app, this is where we're going to show the different elements, the happy, sad, etc. And what we could do is when we're testing this in the index.ios, we could have a separate entry point for the feedback app. And the feedback app, there's no need to kind of follow this now, just kind of giving you the concepts of what we would do, is we could then work on a different entry point, and when we're working on that, we could then just set up the UI for the different happy, sad. We'll show you what the finished app looks like. Just because we're running out of time, we won't show you that, but I'll show you what it looks like in the finished view so that we can walk through and see what it looks like. So with that done, I think we're probably kind of ready. How much time do we have for like a break, Tammy?
Is this thing on? I always wanted to do that. So we have time for a few questions, and then we can take a short break, and we'll jump back into the second part of the theory. So does anyone have any questions? If you do, raise your hand. I'll come to you with a mic. Not a single question. You guys are brilliant. All right, let's just take 1 minute, and if you need to use the restroom or anything, and then we'll jump right back into it. Mostly I just have to tell Christine a secret.
Okay. And then the quick thing is in terms of what you can do to prep for the next section, if you have it, is I'll just put up the instructions in here. I don't know if, do they have access to the demo 1 instructions?
I have it on
Okay,
here.
okay. Because one thing that we can do really quickly, if you want to just kind of get ahead of the game and you want to run through it, is just go through the demo 2 instructions and just step through 1 and 2. What that does is it's going to just kind of get you set up to run the iOS and the Android projects. Okay, so see in a minute. So we've learned how to kind of create a couple of simple apps, and what we're going to do is now, how would we integrate that into an existing native application? So one of the key features with React Native is you can have incremental adoption. You don't necessarily actually have to already have like a standalone React Native app. And the way that you do that is if you actually look at the code that gets generated when you create like a sample application to the React Native CLI, if you open up, say, the app delegate, you'll see like an entry point which tells it which is the iOS file or the JavaScript bundle location. And in addition to that, it creates a React view or RCT view. And that RCT view, you can think of it as a UI view. So which means that in your mind, you can basically drop it wherever you could put a UI view. And the example you see here is for one where the component is called Mashup, and it's got some initial properties that it's passing in that's nil. In a sense, once you create a React view, there is a bridge that actually passes data back and forth, as I mentioned previously. And again, the React view could be any part. It could take out the whole view of your app. It could just be a little portion of your app. And you can even have multiple views in different screens of your app. And the key thing that you want to do, just to make it more performant, is that you want to reuse that bridge. Because creating a new bridge and starting it up to send instructions back and forth is expensive. So the way that you could do that in iOS to create this bridge that you could reuse is just simply creating an RCT bridge or a React bridge and initializing it. And in the delegate, you could set up a delegate which tells it where is the JavaScript bundle. And then when you're initializing the React view, you're just passing in this bridge so that it can reuse that. Similar, but slightly different, but in Android, Android has something called a React Native host, and the React Native host just manages the React view, and it also has a handle on a React Instance Manager. So you would create a React Native host that is, probably you can put it on your application subclass, because that's where you could probably have like a singleton. And then once that is available, then you can get an access to the actual instance manager. And once you have that instance manager, then when you're creating a React view, you would use that instance manager to actually start the application. And the way that you would do it in Android is that you would just call start React application on a React view. So it's slightly different than iOS, but it's similar, doing the same thing way, way, way under the hood. And the way you would do it in Android is that you would also set up a fragment. A fragment is just like a little piece of UI. And the way we're going to do it in our app is we're going to set up a fragment that we can reuse to create views from different places. So that's kind of like a very quick intro into what we're going to do. In the demo, we're going to take what we had built in the first demo and insert it into a native application. And then we're also going to take, so these are sort of like the three pieces of what a React Native application integrated is going to look like. This is a React Native view. The little pop-up is a React Native view. And that profile with Instagram is also another React Native view. And everything is actually native when it's finally running. OK. So what I actually did during the break is a couple of things. I went to the demo 2. And in the demo 2, it's actually a standalone, it's like a native application. So I opened up my workspace. So let's go here. So this is the actual workspace that we have. And quickly, if we're going to go through this, it's actually a native application that's a photo sharing app. So it's got a lot of different files in here. The ones that we're going to be concerned about in the iOS world is one that's going to be the view controller that shows the shared view. And we're going to have a few different view controllers for like the settings view. You're going to work on that during the lab. And we're also going to add in some of the views for the feedback. So you can always take a look at the app and see all of the different things it's doing. While we're doing this, I'm actually going to also open up the Android Studio, because we're going to be doing a little bit of Android later, but I'll have that running in the background. So for everyone else, hopefully you actually run through the different steps in the instructions, which including installing Yarn and then just running React Native start. And that's what I did here. Let's see if I scroll up, see it. I just called React Native start in the module, and that actually kicks up the React packager. You generally do that if you have like a standalone native application. Instead of React Native run iOS, which kicks everything up and starts the packager, that starts the packager separately. And once I did that, then I was able to open up the workspace. And now if I were to build this, I was told use iPhone 7. So I'm going to use iPhone 7 so it looks a little bigger. And so now I'm starting the workspace. And while that's building, that looks slightly better. And while that's building and getting everything set up, I'm just going to start up the Android Studio. And if you're using the very first time and you follow the instruction, you just had to import the project. And when you imported the project, what you needed to do is just navigate to the Android folder and start it. I'd already done this previously, so let me just open it. So if you were to run your app for the very first time, you're probably going to be presented with a login screen. So you're just going to have to either create a new user or sign up with it. In the back end, it's going to register you. And then once you do that, you should get like a shared view of all of these different things. So you should see something similar to what I'm seeing right now. OK. So let me just get this out of the way, and let's just dive into iOS code. So in iOS code, what we're going to do is, if I navigate here, this is the shared view. Let's take care of this bouncing thing. So the shared view is actually blank right now because we haven't brought in the React Native view. And also this part is blank right now because this is actually going to be a React Native view. So let's get started. First things first, we want to create a React Native bridge that we're going to be reusing. And we also gave you some boilerplate code. And we have a singleton called Mashup React Manager. And the Mashup React Manager, it's not doing much here. But what we're going to do is actually create a bridge and also create a helper method that we're going to use. The other thing I want to let you know is that when I set up the standalone application, I actually brought in some of the React Native dependencies by using CocoaPods, and I can later on after the lab I can actually show you how that was done. But first, let's actually create a bridge. So import React. Once we've imported React, just create a private variable. Let's just call it bridge, if I could spell. RCT bridge. Make it a forced unwrap. And now we have this. Let's actually create a function that we're going to reuse when needed. But before that, actually, let's jump to a different thing. We're going to create a view, an extension to Mashup React Manager that the bridge is going to use to know what is the source URL. That's just something you have to do. So an extension. And it's going to implement RCT bridge delegate. And one of the functions that it needs to implement is called source URL. And the source URL just tells it where it's going to find the JavaScript bundle. And just bundle. It's RCT bundle provider. And then you just say, want a bundle for root. Actually, let's see. Make sure I got this right. Settings, shared settings. And then here you can just call JS bundle for URL and pass in the actual index file, which is index.ios. And the resource is null. Fallback resource is null. And then just return this. So just put a return function in this. And then you've got your delegate set up. And once you've got the delegate set up, we're just going to create a nice little helper function. Create bridge if needed. And it's going to return an RCT bridge. And in this function, we are just going to call either return a bridge if it's available, or if not, we're just going to initialize it. So RCT bridge. And the one we're going to use is this initialization where we pass in the delegate, which is going to give us the JavaScript location. And for now, the launch options, we're just going to return null. So we've got this function. Now let's create a handy-dandy function that we're going to use from other view controllers to set up the React view. And we're just going to call it view for module. We're going to pass in a module name, which is going to be a string. And then the other parameter is going to be initial properties that we may want to pass into our component. So initial properties. And it's going to be a key value, which is going to be a string for the key. And this could be an optional argument. It could be nil. So in our view for module, we're just going to create a handle to the bridge by calling create bridge if needed. And once we have this bridge, then we are going to just create our root view, which is an RCT view, and call the initialization function that for a React view, which takes in the bridge and takes in a module name and takes in initial properties. So in the bridge, let's pass in the view bridge. In the module name, let's pass in the module name that was passed into this method. And in the initial properties, let's pass in the initial properties that was passed to this method. And then just return the root view. And I made a mistake here, so let's make sure that we are returning a root view. Let's see what it's complaining about. Expected separator. Let me check my notes. Okay. All right, so we've got our view for module function that we can now reuse in different functionalities. And the first place we want to use it is we're going to use it in this shared feed view controller. So in the shared view controller, which we have boilerplate code for, it's basically not doing much of anything except setting up a view and calling a load photos. And in here, the first thing we're going to do is import React. And once we've imported React, we're going to change the photos view into our kind of a root, our RCT root view, because they kind of like, you can change a UI view for a photo view. And then in here, when the view is loaded, it calls the load photos function, and this is a good place to add the React view. So we're just going to say the photos view, and we're going to set it to, let's call in our singleton, and then call in the handy dandy function that we created, view for module. And what we're going to pass in the view for module is we are going to pass a string which represents the module, and I'll show you where that is in a minute. And for initial properties for now, we're just going to pass in nil. You could actually pass in props into the initial properties if you wanted to pass in something into the component. And last, we're just going to say self.view.add subview and add the photos view. And so where did this view for module and media app come from? So where it came from is in the JavaScript code that we created that is actually in the starter app. And I'm going to go show you what that JavaScript code looks like. We're going to be working with it in a little bit, so might as well see where it is. So in demo 2, in starter, in mashup, since I'm using Sublime, I can just sort of like drag it in there. So, but if you go to demo 2 starter and you go to the index.ios, you're going to see that we've registered through components as root components. One is media app and one is feedback app. So we can go ahead and that's what we're using media app for now, and that's where it comes from. So if we just save this and actually run it, build and rerun it, we should now get our feedback or our Instagram view in there. So you see it's loading it here, and now you've got your Instagram view there inside of your native app. It's all actually running natively. Is everyone kind of followed along so far? Everyone in same place? Okay, cool. So the thing that we're going to do next is, you could handle here, this is another React view. It's just another pop-up. It's actually being run by this feedback view controller. It's another boilerplate code, which looks very similar to what we did before. But the thing that we want to do differently in here is we've got native code that is running that we want to call from React Native. So what we want to happen is when the user actually taps on one of these votes or gives feedback, it's actually going to call an API which updates the backend server. To do that, what you need to do is expose this API inside of what we call a native module. So we've got some boilerplate code to show you how to do that. So we're going to work with that first before we actually set up the view. So in feedback module bridge, what you want to do when you want to create a native module is actually conform to the RCT bridge module. And if you go to feedback module bridge.m, this is the we actually have to write code in Objective-C because the React Native feedback is Objective-C. Let's just comment a few of the lines. And what this is doing is it's defining that you're going to be exporting a feedback module, and you're going to be exporting one method within that. So where is this feedback module coming from? So we've got this Swift class called feedback_module.swift. And then this feedback_module.swift, we've exposed to our Objective-C this class called feedback module, and it has another function that we've exposed called save. And what this is doing is actually taking in whether or not you clicked vote, happy or sad, and it's going to send that back to the server. And it's expecting an identifier, and the identifiers are different from each one of these photos. It's saved on the server, and it's expecting an identifier, and it's going to make that update. But the key thing here is that you're exposing this through Objective-C through a bridge. And so once you've exposed that, then what you can do is then you can use it inside of your React Native code. But first, let's actually stitch up the views so we can both see the actual icons and also pass the data. So if you go back to feedback view controller, here's where we can just very quickly do what you had done before. It should be very familiar at this point. Our feedback view is going to be a React view. And in this React view, we're going to show the feedback or load it up at this point using the same thing we did before. So feedback view is equal to shared instance and view for module. And in this case, the module is called feedback app. And for initial properties, what we want to pass in the identifier. And the identifier is actually passed into this view controller when somebody actually clicks on that little icon. We're going to pass in an identifier. We just call it identifier and pass in an identifier. So now we're actually doing something different, passing in initial props to our core module. Then make sure we add it to the self.view.add. So we've kind of done a little part of it. Now we're actually going to go back into our React Native code and make sure we are actually using what we've exposed. So if you had your Sublime actually up and running, or whatever text editor is your choice, open up feedback app. It should be under your JS directory. And what this is doing is actually setting up the three icons related to the three images. And it's looping through, and it's actually has a click handler. So what it has is it's setting up an image, and the image is basically of a particular style, width and height. And the source of what it is, everything is local to this React. And so this actually is coming from this section from the images folder. And as it's doing this, it actually has an on press. So you can, if you wanted to make anything clickable, you just wrap it in a touchable opacity. And there's other options, but this is one way that you could do it. And then you could pass in an on press prop where you could say, I want this to happen. And in this case, what you're doing is right now, all you're doing is you're logging the fact that somebody tapped it. But what you could do is now, what we're going to do is you are going to now not just log that actually somebody clicked on or selected a particular image, but we're also going to say that we want to now call the native API that we exposed. So the way we'd expose the native API is through something. First of all, you need to bring in native modules. And once you have native modules, then you can call native modules.feedback and then call in the save function. But just to make things easier, we're going to dereferencing this. And for some folks that are asked, this is basically like ES 2015 or ES6 syntax. So there's a couple of things that you can do that make it really nice to work with JavaScript. So the module that we exposed in our iOS code is called module. And you can dereference this so that you don't have to do a lot of typing. So once we have this module, then what you can do is inside of your on-click handler, what you're going to do is call feedback module.save and pass in the parameters that you had exposed in your native code. There are three parameters that we've exposed. One was the React tag. It's something that you probably don't want to worry about right now, but it's something that differentiates one root view from another. The other thing we want to pass in is what did the user select? Did they select love, sad, or happy? So that's selected. And lastly, we want to pass in sort of what was passed into us, what was the identifier. And this was passed in initial properties, so we can just pass this .props.identifier. And with that, we've actually kind of set up a way that we can call native code. So let's build and rerun this app. And the two things we should see is that we should now see the UI for the feedback. And now that we see the UI, we should also be able to interact with it and actually call backend code. And one thing I didn't have a chance to show you, but would be interesting right now, is if you want to ever do logging, like see what your code is, you could run something like React Native log iOS. And it's going to dump a bunch of different things. So for example, if we click on this, you should now see your view, whereas before it was blank. And you should also see things that got sent into. It says running application feedback app with these app params. And there's a couple of things, the root tag, initial props, and the identifier, which is going to be different from each one of these photos. So then if we select one, let's select here, and we click out of it, you see that your UI changed, so your native code was called. So that's a way that you can actually call APIs or native code from actual JavaScript code. So I'm going to switch up real quick and kind of get a sense of how you would do something similar to Android. A lot of folks here, I want to kind of get another show of hands. How many people actually set up Android environment? 1, 2, 3. OK. So for those of you, you can kind of like just watch along. The joy of watching Android development. So what we're going to do in Android is we are going to do a couple of things. I have my Android set up here. It's already up and running. The core code that I need in here is actually inside of this mashup directory. And the key thing, similar to what was there in iOS, we're going to be worrying about a few things. Mashup application is sort of going to be our application logic. That's where we're going to set in our, we're going to set up the React Native host that we're going to reuse to set up bridges. React Fragment is what we're going to use to kind of set up a lot of the boilerplates so that other folks that want to kind of create a React view can reuse that over and over again. And then we're going to reuse the React Fragment or subclass it to set up the view. So it's a slightly different view, but let's kind of see what the flow looks like. All right, so how about I just kind of get it up and running. And the other thing that you're going to do is, the other thing that we did for Android to set up the React is we, through Gradle, sourced in the React Native library. So that's also in there. If you're doing your own native app, you would have to do that first. OK, so while that's running, I want to kind of get a sense of what the code we're going to change. We can actually start changing the code right now. So Mashup Application. So here, this is where we've subclassed application. And this is where we can actually set up our bridge or our shared bridge. And the way that you would do that is you would say it implements React Application. And then because it implements React Application, it's expecting you to return back a React Native host. And so let's actually first create a React Native host. So add a new private final React Native host. And what we're going to add is a new React. Let me do it on a new line. OK. Let's make this slightly bigger so you can see it. So new React Native host. And it just drops in some of the boilerplate code, but you need to pass in application context. The get use developer support, this is something that lets it know whether or not you're running React Native in developer or in production mode. So you can just call build config. Debug. And here, this is a list of packages that are exposed. These are the native modules that are exposed. You could add your own modules like feedback module, but by default, what you would be adding is just the main package. This is just default things that you need to do to set up React Native. And if you weren't creating it yourself in your native, it's already pre-set up for you when you create a standalone React Native app. So we're going to return, it's an arrays as list. And it's actually of type React package. And only one package we're going to return, and it's new main React package. So now we have our React Native host. We need to return it as something that that if you're implementing React application, it expects. So to do that, you override this one function. It's called get React Native host. And you just want to return. So that's what you need to do to set up React Native host, and then you can actually pick up and use this React Native host from a fragment. So let's quickly see, we should have this up and running. This is our application. I'm just going to go ahead and log in. I'd created a previous user. And after I log in, it's actually going to ask me for a permission screen. And what you need is that if you're running it on Marshmallow and above, you actually need to set up permissions. This is only needed to, because when you do the debugger screen and all these overlays or the red boxes, it needs permission to draw over the apps, and that's what you need to do here. So you just select it, and click the back button, and you should be all set to go. At this point, you haven't done much of anything. What we're going to do in this next step is just to fill out this information in here, similar to what we did with iOS. But in this case, what we're going to do is work with how do we set up that view. So how we set up the view is, let's turn our attention. We actually created a boilerplate thing called React Fragment. And React Fragment, what it's going to do is we're going to use this to create any of the other views that we need. And right now, React Fragment is extending dialog fragment. And the only reason we're extending dialog fragment is in here, we need to have a way to kind of set up this pop-up. So we're using dialog fragment instead of, say, just a simple fragment. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to set up what React needs. So let's first set up a React view. So just a private variable that's just going to hold a React root view, and just call it mReact root view. We're going to set up another variable that's going to hold the instance manager. Nope. Autocomplete. And then we're also going to set up another variable that can potentially hold any of the initial properties that you have. I'm just going to call it initial props and set it to null initially. It's a bundle. Okay. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is just kind of hook everything up. How do we set up our React view with Android? The way we would do this is, number one, is that we would need to, first of all, get a handle onto the React instance view and then initialize the React view. We can do that on, for example, on onAttach. So override the onAttach method. So public void onAttach. And that takes in a context and call super onAttach and pass in the same context. And then once we've got that, let's just initialize the instance manager and the root view. So let's just make this a new React view and just pass in the context. And then in addition to that, let's just get a handle on the React instance manager. And you can get the React instance manager from the React Native host that you created earlier. And so it's in the Mashup application in our example here. You just need to get the activity for the fragment and get the application. And then once you get the application, then you can call get React Native host and get React Native instance. Let's just make this readable. And now you have the handle on your instance manager. And once you have the instance manager, then later on you can use the instance manager to create a root view. So let's go ahead and do that. And a good place to do that is when the activity is created. So you just do public void on activity created, which takes in a bundle with any saved informations. Call super on that. And then at this point, let's just set up the root view. So and the way you do that is called by start application. And you need to give it three things. You need to give it the instance manager, the name of the component, and also the name of any initial properties. But where we're going to get the name of the component, what we can do is we can say that anything that subclasses this is going to get us that information. So I'm just going to create a public abstract. So anyone that subclasses this is going to have to give me the component name. So whether it's feedback app or it's media app. And then I also want to create a function that they can subclass, and let's call it get launch options. For now, we're just going to return the initial props, but classes can subclass this, and this would be a way for them to pass in any initial props. So going back to this portion where we're actually setting up the root view, we would pass in a couple of things. We would pass in, let's just get this right from the notes. Okay, so instance manager, and component name, and launch options. All right, so we've got the activity created. Now we've got our root view. But there's a few things that you need to do when you're working with Android. It needs to be able to handle the back button. And to handle the back button, we are going to say that our React fragment is going to implement a default back button handler. So, and one of the things that you can override when you're implementing that is that you could override, and we've just kind of like set it up there so you don't have to do a lot of typing. You can override invoke back button press so that if there's actually a React view, you can actually call the React view instead of that. The other thing with fragments is that you need to set up the view by, it always calls the onCreate view. And we can set up to that uncomment this line, you just return the React Native view. And there's a bunch of different things that you can do in terms of passing in and letting the React Native host know that that all of these different Android lifecycle methods happened. So we just kind of, since it's all boilerplate, we just included it in there. So we uncomment those lines. And then lastly, you want to sometimes show the developer menu, and that's the last thing that you need to do. So if you wanted to show the debug menu, you would just have to set up something that says, I'm going to recognize that you pressed the menu key, and I'm going to show this. So that's kind of like the boilerplate I need to do to set up the React fragment. And then once you've done that, everything else is pretty straightforward. You could just subclass this React fragment and then just send in all the information you need to do to set it up, which is, let's take an example for the shared feedback fragment. And this is, we actually had some boilerplate for this. Instead of extending fragment, we're going to extend React fragment. And then we're going to set up or overrides two of the main functions that it needs to do to set it up. So once you extend React fragment, it expects you to tell it what exactly is that you're going to override. So the first thing you need to override is you need to tell it what is the component name. So get main component. And then in this case, because it's the shared feedback, we're going to return media app. And then the other thing that you would do is you could also override to pass in some initial props. And what we're going to do is we're going to just return get launch options. Yeah, we're almost done. Just a minute. Yeah. Okay, so then we're going to just return initial props. And once you've done that, you should kind of be up and running in Android. Yeah, Android is a little, as you can see, joy to develop with. There's a lot more steps than in iOS to kind of get it up and running. But once you kind of get set all the plumbing in place, it's actually pretty straightforward to do that with Android. So we got it up and running, and once you've got it up and running, you should be able to, it's fetching the JS bundle, and you should be able to now see your view here. And it's very easy if you wanted to do the same thing to show, to actually show this up. So you've kind of got a sense of how you can actually integrate React Native into iOS and existing Android applications. And so next you can work on the lab. And in the lab, what you're going to do is you're going to work on, say, if you have Android set up, you can see how you can quickly set up the feedback app, and also how you could expose the APIs and use them within Android. And with iOS, just as a refresher, you're going to go ahead and implement the Instagram profile to show how you can actually embed a React view inside of another view. So the lab should take about, I'm not sure, about 50 minutes?
We have about 10 minutes for
Yeah.
the lab, but if you don't finish it, don't worry, because you've got all the materials. You can do it on your own outside of the session. Also, Christine will be available across the room during the next session for additional Q&A, and if you just want to go say hi and thank her, she'll be over there.
Yeah, so about, I guess in about 10 minutes, we're going to do a conclusion?
Yeah, in about 10 minutes, well, probably a little less now, about 8 to 9 minutes, we'll do a wrap-up and conclusion. So don't leave the room. If you feel the need to leave the room, I will chase you down. Don't leave the room.
Okay, and I'll be walking around just if you have any questions about what we had so far. All right, so I'm going to be available at the room across for lab if you have any additional questions, or just whether it's about the lab or in general about React Native. And pretty much just wanted to wrap up and say that what you probably got a sense of is what you can do in terms of development with React Native, and also not just the basics, but how you could actually integrate React Native into existing iOS and Android apps. And hopefully with that, you can actually get going and just think about scenarios where you want to do cross-platform development, whether it's iOS and Android. And there could be scenarios where you may also have reusable code that you don't want to throw out, or you may actually have existing native libraries that want to hook into. You can definitely do all of that with React Native. So hopefully this gets a sense and gives you a chance of some of the other things that you can do with React, and use it to do some incremental adoption. Test a few things out. See if it actually works for you. Is the development flow make things a lot faster? Because at least from experience, you can reuse a lot of common code. So hopefully you can go check it out and try out a few things with React Native. Thank you so much.